Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Taylor felt the world cock and blur in a way she hadn't endured since the darkest days of her life. The words Ridge had just uncovered echoing in her mind like a grim shower, because this wasn't just another secret exhumed in the endless cycle of backstabbings and rapprochements. This was a verity so disastrous it readdressed every memory she had precisely stored down as fact, every decision she had justified as necessary. Every immolation she had told herself was made for love, and as Ridge stood there with the DNA results pulsing in his hand, his face drained of color and his eyes burning with a admixture of unbelief, fury, and profound heartache, Taylor saw in a moment that the man she loved had crossed a threshold from which neither of them could ever completely return, his voice coarse as he spoke the words audibly, attesting what neither of them had ever dared to imagine. That the child whose actuality had shaped alliances, battles, and decades of emotional warfare was who everyone believed, and in that moment Taylor's precisely constructed countenance shattered, because she understood the counter-accusations briskly than Ridge could articulate them, understood how this disclosure would ripple outward, destroying connections, rewriting family trees, and exposing falsehoods buried so deep they had begun to feel like verity, and her body replied before her mind could catch up. Her breath hitching sprucely as a cold surge of horror swept through her casket, her knees weakening as if the bottom itself had dissolved beneath her, and she tried to speak, tried to deny it, to offer some clinical explanation, some cerebral frame to soften the blow, but no words came, only a strangled rustle as Ridge continued, his voice cracking now, wrathfulness and grief colliding as he demanded to know how this could have happened, how she could have known, how she could have lived with it. And Taylor's vision tunneled, the room spinning as flashes of the once assaulted her, moments she had replayed numerous times now rearranging themselves into a ruinous new narrative, every touch, every argument, every gash suddenly questionable, and the weight of it each pressed down on her with suffocating force, because this wasn't simply about maternity, it was about identity, about the fragile stories people tell themselves to survive, and hers had just been cancelled in a single, enduring moment, her heart pounding so violently. She stressed it might tear itself piecemeal as Ridge's eyes bore into her, searching for answers, searching for guilt, searching for some interpretation of the woman he allowed. He knew, and Taylor felt an inviting swell of guilt and terror, knowing that no explanation could undo what had been revealed, that indeed the most nuanced verity would sound like treason now, and as the room sounded to close in on her, the sound of Ridge's voice fading into a distant roar, her legs eventually gave out, her body collapsing to the bottom as knowledge slipped down, not out of weakness but out of sheer emotional load, because the mortal mind can only bear so much before it shuts down, and as she fell, Ridge rushed forward too late, the DNA results fluttering from his hand like a cruel final punctuation mark, the shocking verity now irrevocably exposed, leaving behind a stupefied silence filled with unanswered questions, broken trust, and the certainty that nothing, no love, no history, no participated pain, would ever be the same again. Ridge dropped to his knees beside her as Taylor lay crumpled on the bottom, her body constitutionally still, and for a intimidating second he wondered if the verity he'd just uncovered hadn't only shattered their lives but had physically broken her as well, his hands shaking as he called her name again and again, the sound raw and panicked, because no matter how furious he was, no matter how betrayed and blindsided he felt, the sight of Taylor unconscious at his bases sliced through him with a primitive fear that reminded him just how deeply entwined their lives had always been, and as he brushed her hair back from her face, searching for any sign that she could hear him, recollections surged unsought, of a woman who had been his retreat and his battleground, his topmost comfort and his most continuing complication, and now the keeper of a secret so enormous it felt as if it had swallowed decades whole. When Taylor eventually stirred, it was with a faint moan, her switches fluttering as reality crept back in piece by piece, the cold bottom beneath her, Ridge's voice swimming above her like a lifeline, and also the verity crashing down again with merciless clarity, her breath catching as she tried to sit up, only to be gently restrained by Ridge's hands as he prompted her to stay still, his voice softer now but threaded with an unmistakable edge, because whatever concern he felt didn't abolish what he'd learned. And Taylor saw it in his eyes the moment she concentrated on his face, that commodity irrevocable had happened between them, commodity beyond wrathfulness, beyond hurt, commodity near to a abecedarian rupture, and as she plotted to find words, Ridge helped her into a seated position, leaning her back against the settee, the silence between them heavy and stifling, broken only by her uneven breathing. "I need you to tell me the verity," Ridge said at last, each word measured, deliberate, as if he were hysterical that raising his voice would unleash commodity he could no longer control, and Taylor closed her eyes, gashes slipping free despite her sweats to remain collected, because for all her training, all her times of understanding the mortal psyche, she had no way set up a way to outmaneuver guilt when it eventually demanded to be conceded, and she knew now that denial was meaningless, that the DNA results had stripped down every subcaste of nebulosity she might have cleaved to, leaving her exposed in a way she had no way been ahead. She began haltingly, her voice pulsing as she spoke of a time marked by confusion and fear, by choices made under extraordinary emotional strain, explaining how query had taken root and grown into commodity monstrous over the times, how she had induced herself that guarding everyone involved, especially the child, had justified her silence, and as she spoke, Ridge heated with gripped jaw and darkening eyes, absorbing each word while the counter-accusations extended inside him, because every explanation only underlined the reality that his life had been shaped by a taradiddle he'd no way acceded to live, and the wrathfulness that surged through him was explosive but cold and consuming, the kind that settles deep and refuses to dissipate. "You took down my right to know," he said still, the hurt beneath the blameworthiness more ruinous than any cried combination could have been, and Taylor squinched as if struck, because she knew he was right, knew that no quantum of good intentions could abolish that abecedarian violation, and she tried to respond, to explain that fear had guided her, fear of loss, fear of chaos, fear of destroying commodity that formerly felt so fragile, but indeed as the words left her mouth, she honored how concave they sounded now, how shy they were in the face of the damage done. Ridge stood suddenly, pacing the room as he ran a hand through his hair, the DNA results still lying on the bottom like in blameworthiness neither of them could ignore, and Taylor watched him with mounting dread, understanding that this was only the morning, that the verity would not stay contained within these walls, that it would ripple outward to affect children, siblings, suckers, and rivals likewise, rewriting histories and continuing old injuries, and the weight of that consummation pressed down on her casket until it was hard to breathe, because she had only altered Ridge's reality but had potentially destabilized an entire family structure erected on hypotheticals that no longer held. As Ridge spoke again, his voice rose, the restraint beginning to fracture as questions poured out of him, questions about who knew, about how long, about what differently might still be hidden, and Taylor answered as actually as she could, each concession feeling like another thread unraveling, and with every answer, Ridge felt the ground shift further beneath him, because the history he allowed he understood was dissolving into commodity strange and deeply unsettling, forcing him to defy not only Taylor's conduct but his own eyeless spots, his own conspiracy in accepting a narrative without ever questioning it, and that consummation was nearly as painful as the treason itself. Hours sounded to pass as they talked, argued, fell into silence, and spoke again, the emotional intensity declining and surging like a grim drift, until eventually prostration caught them both, leaving behind a fragile, uneasy quiet, and Ridge sank into a president contrary Taylor, his posture heavy with the burden of what lay ahead, because he knew there was no simple resolution, no dramatic gesture that could undo decades of consequence, and Taylor, watching him, felt the ruinous clarity that love alone would not be enough to save them this time, that responsibility would demand offerings she wasn't sure she was strong enough to make. In the fate, as Ridge prepared to leave, demanding space to suppose, to breathe, to decide how to move forward, Taylor reached out artificially, her fritters brushing his sleeve, and he broke, looking down at her with an expression so disaccorded it broke her heart, because in that moment she saw not just his wrathfulness but his grief, his disorientation, his sense of having lost commodity impalpable yet essential, and when he gently but forcefully pulled down, she knew that whatever path lay ahead would be marked by distance and query, and as the door closed behind him, the futurity of the sound echoed through the room like a verdict. Alone at last, Taylor sank back against the settee, the events of the day replaying in grim fractions, and she allowed herself to completely feel the consequences she had long kept at bay, the shame, the anguish, the fear of what would come next, because the verity, formerly revealed, is a force that cannot be contained, and she understood now that the conking spell had been only the body's first response to a reckoning that would unfold over time, reshaping lives and commitment in ways none of them could yet completely comprehend, setting the stage for a new chapter in the ongoing saga of love, treason, and adaptability that defined the world of the bold and the beautiful, where secrets no way stay buried ever and every disclosure leaves its mark long after the shock has faded. The night stretched endlessly after Ridge's departure, each nanosecond crawling by with a nearly cruel deliberateness, and Taylor remained exactly where he'd left her for a long time, gaping at the unrestricted door as if it might renew on its own and ever restore the world to what it had been only hours before. But the silence was unyielding, pressing in on her from all sides, forcing her to defy the reality that the verity she had stressed for so long was no longer hers alone to carry. And as the adrenaline faded, a deep, bone-sick pang settled into her casket, the kind that came not from physical strain but from the collapse of emotional defenses that had held establishment for decades. Ultimately, she rose on unsteady legs and moved through the house like a ghost, touching familiar objects as though resting herself in them might anchor her to commodity solid, recollections adhering to every face, monuments of moments that now felt tainted by elision, and she wondered with growing dread how numerous of those recollections would survive unchanged once the verity made its way through the family, because she knew Ridge too well to believe he'd keep this contained, not when it involved identity, lineage, and a treason that cut so deeply into his sense of tone, and the study of the ineluctable competitions to come transferred a fresh surge of nausea through her. By morning, sleep had no way truly claimed her, only brief, restless setbacks filled with fractured dreams in which voices lapped and faces blurred, and when the sun eventually rose, its light felt protrusive rather than comforting, illuminating a world that sounded irreversibly altered, and Taylor set up herself bracing for the first ripple, the moment when the verity would begin to move beyond the private desolation she and Ridge had participated, because exposures of this magnitude no way stayed contained for long, not in a family bound together by passion, contest, and a long history of secrets that had a way of surfacing at the worst possible moments. Ridge, meanwhile, spent the night in stir, driving erratically through familiar thoroughfares that suddenly felt foreign, the DNA results replaying in his mind like a broken record, each fact refusing to settle into commodity he could reuse fairly, because no matter how numerous times he told himself that the wisdom was irrefragable, that the substantiation was clear, his feelings lagged before, swinging hectically between rage, unbelief, grief, and a concave impassiveness that frightened him further than the wrathfulness ever could, and he realized with bitter clarity that the man he'd been before learning the verity no longer was, replaced by someone who would have to rebuild his understanding of family from the ground up. As the day wore on, the ineluctable calls began, questions urged by his distraction, his cropped responses, his incapability to mask the fermentation beneath the face, and each commerce reminded him that silence was no longer an option, that opinions had to be made about who merited to know and when, because every hour he delayed only compounded the fallout, and the weight of that responsibility bore down on him with suffocating intensity, forcing him to define not only Taylor's choices, but his own part in immortalizing a narrative he'd no way challenged, and that consummation fueled a quiet, sharp guilt that settled alongside his wrathfulness. When Ridge eventually returned to defy Taylor again, it was with a resoluteness that felt brittle but determined, and the pressure between them crepitated the moment they were in the same room, implied words hanging heavy in the air, and Taylor saw incontinently that whatever had shifted inside him overnight had only strengthened the peak between them, his expression guarded, his posture rigid, as though he were bracing himself against another emotional impact, and she knew also that this discussion would not be about conciliation or comfort but about consequences. He told her, in a voice stripped of warmth, that the verity would come out, that he could end and would not cover a taradiddle any longer, and Taylor absorbed his words in stupefied silence, a part of her having always known this moment would come yet still adhering to the faint stopgap that there might be some way to soften the blow, and when she tried to argue for discretion, for a time, Ridge cut her off, not cruelly but forcefully, explaining that every fresh detention would only consolidate the sense of treason for everyone involved, and the futurity in his tone left no room for concession. As the reality of public exposure sank in, Taylor felt a different kind of fear take hold, one embedded not in immediate shock but in long-term loss, because she understood that connections she cherished might not survive this, that trust formerly broken at this scale infrequently healed fairly, and she wondered, with a sinking heart, whether her part in the family would ever be the same, Whether she'd always be seen through the lens of this deception, no matter how important guilt she expressed or responsibility she accepted, and that prospect felt nearly as ruinous as the original disclosure itself. The first battle beyond Ridge came sooner than she anticipated, feelings kindling nearly incontinently as questions were asked and allegations hurled, voices rising in unbelief and fury, and Taylor set up herself standing in the eye of a storm she had intentionally been erecting for times, every attempt at explanation met with dubitation or outright combination, because for those hearing the verity for the first time, the shock was fresh and undressed, and they had no tolerance for nuance, only a hopeless need to understand how their reality had been so completely distorted, and Taylor bore the mass of that wrathfulness, absorbing it with a quiet abdication born of long-suppressed guilt. Ridge watched these relations with an equivocal heart, torn between a moping instinct to cover Taylor and a deeper obligation to the verity, and as he saw the fallout unfold, he grappled with his own pain in a new way, realizing that the disclosure had only altered his history but was laboriously reshaping his present, forcing him to choose where he stood and what values he'd prioritize going forward, and that clarity, painful as it was, began to solidify into commodity-like resoluteness, because while he could undo what had been done, he could decide how it would define him moving forward. For Taylor, the days that followed were marked by a profound loneliness, indeed when girdled by people, because the familiar measures of her life felt off balance, exchanges strained, ganders laden with judgment or pity, and she came to understand that fainting had been her body's way of escaping a moment her mind was yet ready to endure, but there would be no similar escape now, no unconsciousness to shield her from the long, grinding process of responsibility, and she resolved, still and sorrowfully, to face it head-on, indeed if it bring her everything she formerly believed she had secured. As weeks passed, the original shock gave way to deeper, more complicated feelings for everyone involved, wrathfulness evolving into grief, grief into delicate questions about remission and identity, and Ridge and Taylor set up themselves navigating a new, fragile dynamic, one defined less by participated history and further by conservative distance, because while the love between them had dissolved entirely, it had been irrevocably altered, reshaped by a verity that could no way be unseen, and they both tasted that whatever unborn awaited them would bear little resemblance to the history they had lost. In quieter moments, Taylor reflected on the irony that a disclosure she had formerly justified as defensive had rather caused bottomless detriment, and she understood now, with painful clarity, that secrets meant to shield others frequently end up segregating the bone who keeps them, and as she moved forward into an uncertain future, stripped of visions and forced to rebuild trust one fragile step at a time, she accepted that this was the cost of verity delayed, a reckoning that spared no bone and changed everyone, leaving behind a geography ever altered by a single, inarguable fact that could no way again be ignored. In the months that followed, the sharp edges of the disclosure dulled only slightly, no way fading but settling into a patient pain that reminded everyone involved that life before the verity and life after it were two entirely different realities, and Ridge set up himself moving through his days with a heightened mindfulness of how fragile certainty truly was, because every commerce, every family gathering, every quiet moment alone carried the echo of what had been lost, and yet, within that loss, there surfaced an unanticipated clarity about what signified most to him now, forcing him to review fidelity, honesty, and the kind of father and mate he wanted to be in a world no longer gentled by assuring visions. Taylor, for her part, committed herself to the slow, humbling work of form, not with grand gestures or dramatic pleas for remission, but with thickness, tolerance, and an acceptance that some injuries might no way completely heal, and she learned to endure the discomfort of being misdoubted, of having her motives questioned indeed in moments of genuine kindness, because she understood that trust, formerly broken, couldn't be demanded back, only earned over time, if at each, and that understanding marked a quiet but profound shift in her, one that stripped down tone apologies and left behind a more honest, if more vulnerable, interpretation of herself. Ridge observed this metamorphosis with conservative distance, doubtful whether it would eventually count, because while he could see her guilt was real, the part of him that had been blindsided by the DNA results remained cautious, defensive of a heart that had been shaken to its core, and he scuffled daily with the question of whether love could evolve to survive such a abecedarian breach, or whether some backstabbings irrevocably alter the emotional geography beyond form, and that Query followed him like a shadow, shaping his choices and tempering his stopgap. Family dynamics continued to shift in subtle but significant ways, exchanges getting more deliberate, silences heavier with implied history, and yet, amid the pressure, there were moments of unanticipated connection, cases where honesty, painful as it was, allowed for a deeper understanding than had ever was ahead, and Ridge began to fate that while the Verity had destroyed one interpretation of their family, it was also laying the root for commodity more authentic, commodity no longer propped up by hypotheticals and deletions, indeed if that authenticity came at a steep emotional cost. For Taylor, the memory of collapsing to the bottom remained pictorial, not as a symbol of weakness but as a turning point, the moment her body had refused to carry a burden her heart could no longer justify, and she frequently reflected on how near she had come to losing everything without ever truly facing herself, and that mindfulness fueled her determination to live else going forward, to choose translucency over fear. Indeed, when honesty hovered her sense of security.